The Greatest Story Never Told. 28th of January, 1944. 08:15 hours. War Department Building, Washington, District of Columbia. Major General Alexander Searles, Chief of the Bureau of Public Relations, sat at his mahogany desk reading the press release scheduled for distribution in 4 hours. His hands trembled slightly as he turned each page of Lieutenant Colonel William Edwin Dias's eyewitness account of the Bataan Death March. Prepared for simultaneous publication in 107 newspapers across the United States and Canada. "My God," he whispered, setting down page 37, which detailed the bayoneting of American prisoners too weak to walk. "We've been sitting on this for 5 months." What Searles didn't fully comprehend as he prepared to release the most explosive war testimony of the Pacific conflict was that the man who had risked everything to bring this truth to light, the pilot who had escaped from a supposedly escape-proof prison and fought his way through enemy territory to tell America what was happening to its captured sons, had been dead for 37 days. And the circumstances of his death, the timing, the location, the official explanations that seemed just slightly too convenient, would raise questions that would echo for generations. The file on Searles's desk contained more than testimony about Japanese war crimes. It contained evidence of another kind of crime, one perpetrated not by an enemy, but by men who believed they were protecting national interests. The complete story of Ed Dias wasn't just about what he had witnessed in the Philippines. It was about what happened when an American hero tried to tell the truth, and what those in power did to silence him. The mathematics were staggering. Lieutenant Colonel Dias had documented atrocities against 78,000 American and Filipino prisoners during a forced march covering 65 miles. He had witnessed the deaths of approximately 7,000 to 10,000 men in 6 days. He had cataloged the systematic starvation of 2,000 American prisoners at the Davao Penal Colony, where daily rations amounted to 600 calories, 1/5 of what a working man required. He had observed the death rate among prisoners reaching 30% within the first year of captivity. He had recorded the torture of dozens of individuals, the execution of hundreds who could not keep pace, the denial of water to thousands marching in 95-degree heat. But there were other numbers in the file, numbers that told a different story. 5 months. That was how long the War Department had suppressed Dias's testimony after his arrival in the United States in August 1943. 23 weeks during which he had been sequestered, debriefed, and ordered to silence. 147 days between his final meeting with Army Air Forces Commanding General Henry Arnold and his death in a plane crash that multiple witnesses would later describe as suspicious. 37 days between that crash and the release of his testimony. A delay that meant he would never see his story told, never receive recognition while alive, never answer the questions that his revelations would raise. William Edwin Dias was born on the 9th of August, 1916, in Albany, Texas, the son of Judge Richard Dias and his wife Hallie. His fascination with flight began at age 4, when a barnstorming pilot took him up in a biplane that circled the small town at 500 feet. On the 26th of September, 1927, the 11-year-old boy stood in a crowd of 15,000 people in Abilene, Texas, watching Charles Lindbergh, fresh from his transatlantic triumph, land his Spirit of St. Louis at the municipal airfield. From that moment, Dias knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He worked 3 jobs simultaneously through high school and college, washing dishes, pumping gas, and clerking at a grocery store, saving every dollar for flying lessons that he took in secret from his parents. At John Tarleton College in Stephenville, Texas, he excelled academically, served as class president, and commanded the Reserve Officers Training Corps detachment. In 1936, he graduated and immediately enrolled in the United States Army Air Corps Cadet Training Program. The Army Air Corps in the mid-1930s was an elite service, accepting only 1 in 20 applicants. Of those accepted, only 60% completed the rigorous training program at Randolph and Kelly Fields in San Antonio, known throughout the military as the West Point of the Air. Dias not only completed the program, but graduated in the top 5% of his class, receiving his commission and his wings in 1937. His instructors noted his exceptional natural ability and his aggressive, innovative flying style. By 1941, First Lieutenant Dias commanded the 21st Pursuit Squadron at Hamilton Field in Novato, California. He was 25 years old, leading 36 pilots and 200 ground personnel. His men respected him for his flying skills and his willingness to take the same risks he asked of them. When orders came on the 1st of November, 1941, to deploy to the Philippines, Dias led his squadron aboard the SS President Coolidge with a sense of purpose and excitement. They arrived in Manila on the 20th of November, 1941, 17 days before everything changed. The Japanese attacked the Philippines on the 8th of December, 1941, 8 hours after Pearl Harbor. What happened over the next 4 months would become one of the most controversial episodes of the Pacific War. A story of heroism and sacrifice overshadowed by questions about strategic decisions and abandoned promises. First Lieutenant Dias and his 21st Pursuit Squadron were thrust immediately into combat against an enemy that outnumbered them 4-to-1 in aircraft and 10-to-1 in total forces. Flying his Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, which he nicknamed Kibosh, Dias destroyed a Japanese convoy and shot down 6 enemy aircraft in the first week of combat. Had official records not been lost in the retreat to Bataan, he would have been officially recognized as an ace. But by January 1942, with American air power in the Philippines reduced from 107 fighters to fewer than 20 operational aircraft, Dias and his pilots faced a new reality. There were no longer enough planes for them to fly. On the 21st of January 1942, Dias received orders to report to Infantry Command on the Bataan Peninsula. He and his airmen, trained to fight in the sky, would now fight on the ground with whatever weapons they could find. For a pilot who had spent 6 years learning to master the air, the transition to jungle combat seemed impossible. Yet Dias would prove as skilled at ground warfare as he had been in the cockpit. The Battle of the Points in late January and early February 1942 tested every assumption about what could be expected of men fighting under impossible conditions. Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, their version of Marines, had established positions along the western coast of Bataan, threatening to cut off American and Filipino forces. Dias volunteered to lead 20 men from his squadron in a counterattack that would become America's first amphibious landing of World War II. On the 8th of February, 1942, at 0300 hours, Dias and his 20 airmen turned infantry boarded small boats and landed at Aglaloma Bay. They were facing an entrenched enemy force of approximately 200 Japanese troops who had refused all surrender demands. Dias led his men in a frontal assault that lasted 11 hours. By 1400 hours, the Japanese position had been eliminated. 14 of Dias's men were wounded. 3 were killed. But the line held. For his leadership and personal bravery at Aglaloma Bay, Dias received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. The citation noted his extraordinary heroism and intrepidity in action. He was promoted to captain on the 29th of January, 1942, though the promotion orders wouldn't reach him until weeks later. But it was his action on the 2nd of March, 1942, that would demonstrate the full extent of his audacity and skill. Intelligence reports indicated a major Japanese supply depot at Subic Bay, approximately 40 miles north of Bataan. The depot was heavily defended with anti-aircraft batteries and protected by Japanese fighters. Dias proposed a dive bombing raid using P-40 Warhawks, fighters never designed for bombing missions. He jury-rigged Kibosh to carry a 500-pound bomb under its fuselage. At 0700 hours on the 2nd of March, Dias took off alone, flew 40 miles over enemy territory at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, then climbed to 8,000 feet and dove on the supply depot. His first bomb struck a 12,000-ton transport ship, which exploded and sank within minutes. Anti-aircraft fire ripped through his wings and fuselage, but Dias landed back at his base, had the plane patched and rearmed, and flew 2 more sorties that same day. By the end of the day, Dias had damaged a Japanese cruiser, destroyed a second transport of 6,000 tons, sunk 2 100-ton motor launches, destroyed several barges and lighters, and left the docks and warehouses at Subic Bay in flames. He had flown 3 combat missions in a damaged aircraft against a heavily defended target and returned each time. For this action, he received his 2nd Distinguished Service Cross. But individual heroism, no matter how remarkable, could not alter the strategic mathematics of the Philippines campaign. By April 1942, 78,000 American and Filipino troops on Bataan faced a Japanese force of 120,000 with complete air superiority and naval support. The defenders were receiving 1,000 calories of food per day, 1/3 of minimum requirements. Malaria affected 75% of the force. Artillery ammunition was rationed to 10 shells per gun per day. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. On the 9th of April, 1942, Major General Edward King surrendered the forces on Bataan, the largest surrender in American military history. Captain Ed Dias, along with approximately 12,000 American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, became a prisoner of war. What happened next would transform him from a war hero into something else entirely. A witness to atrocities whose testimony would eventually shake the American public and create an international scandal. The Japanese had expected to capture 25,000 prisoners. Instead, they faced 78,000, including 10,000 wounded who could barely walk. The Japanese plan called for the prisoners to march from Mariveles at the southern tip of Bataan to Camp O'Donnell, approximately 65 miles north. Under normal conditions, with proper rest stops and adequate food and water, such a march might take 5 days. What actually happened would become known as the Bataan Death March, one of the worst war crimes of the Pacific conflict. Dias began the march on the 10th of April, 1942, at 1400 hours. The temperature reached 95 degrees. The Japanese provided no water for the first 8 miles. Men who tried to drink from roadside streams were bayoneted. Those who fell were beaten and left to die. Those who stopped to help fallen comrades were shot. I watched a Japanese guard approach a colonel who had collapsed from heat exhaustion, Dias would later testify. The colonel was perhaps 50 years old, a career officer who had served in France in the last war. He couldn't stand. The guard screamed at him in Japanese, which none of us understood. When the colonel didn't respond, the guard bayoneted him in the stomach, withdrew the bayonet, and thrust it through his throat. The colonel died in approximately 30 seconds. The guard wiped his bayonet on the colonel's uniform and walked away. This was 2 hours into the march. The testimony continued for 60 pages, single-spaced, describing atrocity after atrocity with the precision of a trained observer. Dias had decided early in his captivity that he would survive, that he would remember everything. and that he would find a way to tell the world what was happening. He kept mental notes of dates, locations, names of victims and perpetrators, and details of each incident. Corporal James Anderson of Cleveland, Ohio, age 23. Bayoneted for drinking from a carabao wallow on the 11th of April at approximately 1600 hours. Private First Class Robert Morrison of Chicago, Illinois, age 19, beaten to death with rifle butts for falling out of formation on the 12th of April at 0900 hours. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes of Boston, Massachusetts, age 31. Beheaded with a sword for attempting to help a wounded soldier on the 13th of April at 1200 hours. The catalog went on for pages. Dias estimated that he personally witnessed approximately 200 executions during the 6-day march. He calculated, based on the number of bodies he observed along the route and the size of the prisoner column, that between 7,000 and 10,000 men died during the march itself, a death rate of approximately 9 to 13% of the total prisoner population in less than a week. But the march was only the beginning. At Camp O'Donnell, where the prisoners arrived on the 15th of April, 1942, conditions deteriorated further. The camp had been built to house 8,000 Philippine Army trainees. The Japanese forced 25,000 American and 50,000 Filipino prisoners into the facility. There was one water spigot for every 1,000 prisoners. Latrines consisted of open trenches. Medical facilities had no supplies. The death rate at O'Donnell reached 50 men per day within 2 weeks of our arrival, Dias testified. By the end of May, approximately 1,500 Americans and 9,000 Filipinos had died from disease, starvation, and untreated wounds. The Japanese provided approximately 600 calories of food per day. Usually a ball of rice and some vegetable soup. A working man requires 3,000 calories. We were doing hard labor in tropical heat on 1/5 of minimum nutritional requirements. Major William Bradford of Atlanta, Georgia, age 37, died of dysentery on May 5th, 1942. His weight had dropped from 180 pounds to 98 pounds in 4 weeks. Captain Ronald Davies of Portland, Oregon, age 29, died of malaria on May 18th, unable to obtain quinine despite the Japanese having confiscated large stocks from Filipino pharmacies. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Phillips of San Diego, California, age 42, died of beriberi on June 2nd, his body so vitamin deficient that his skin split when touched. Dias maintained his mental catalog, committing to memory the names, ages, hometowns, dates of death, and causes of death for dozens of men. He did so with a purpose. He believed, though he had no logical reason to do so, that he would survive and that he would find a way to tell their stories. In June 1942, the Japanese began transferring prisoners to other facilities. On the 7th of November 1942, Dias arrived at the Davao Penal Colony on Mindanao, the southernmost major island of the Philippines. Dapacol, as it was known, had been built in 1932 by the Philippine Commonwealth as a maximum security prison for the country's most dangerous criminals. The facility covered approximately 25,000 acres of plantation land and had been designed to be escape-proof, modeled after Alcatraz and Devil's Island. The Japanese were using approximately 2,000 American prisoners as slave labor at Dapacol, working them 12 hours per day in rice paddies, clearing jungle, and building roads. Conditions were marginally better than at O'Donnell. The death rate dropped to approximately 5 men per week instead of 50 per day. But the Japanese made clear that escape was impossible. The nearest friendly forces were approximately 400 miles away. The surrounding jungle was dense and unmapped. Local Filipino guerrillas were considered unreliable. The Japanese promised that any prisoner who attempted to escape would be executed along with 10 other prisoners selected at random. Ed Dias spent his first month at Dapakal, recovering from malaria and observing the facility. He noticed that the Japanese had established a routine. Guards changed shifts at predictable times. Work details followed consistent patterns. The camp's rice supply was stored in a specific warehouse. The Japanese kept detailed records of prisoner locations, but became complacent about security as months passed without incident. By January 1943, Dias had formed a plan. He quietly recruited 11 men, carefully selected for specific skills. Lieutenant Samuel Gracchio, a fellow pilot, age 24, who could navigate using the stars. Lieutenant Leo Bolins, a Marine Corps officer, age 26, who spoke Tagalog and could communicate with Filipino guerrillas. Major Mikhail Dobrovich, a doctor, age 31, who could treat injuries and illnesses during an escape. Commander Melvin McCoy, a Navy officer, age 33, who had intelligence training and contacts with the Filipino underground. The group included 8 other officers and enlisted men from the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, plus 2 Filipino convicts who had been imprisoned at Dapakal before the war and knew the surrounding territory. They spent 3 months preparing, stealing supplies bit by bit, hiding food and equipment, creating false records to explain their absence, and establishing contact with guerrilla forces outside the camp. On the 4th of April, 1943, at 1900 hours, during a brief period when guard changes left one section of the perimeter temporarily understaffed, 14 men crawled through a drainage ditch and disappeared into the jungle. It was the only successful large-scale prison escape in the Pacific Theater during World War II. What followed was 45 days of moving through enemy territory, evading Japanese patrols, linking up with guerrilla forces, and slowly making their way south through Mindanao to the coast. They traveled mostly at night, covering approximately 6 miles per day through dense jungle. They survived on rice, bananas, and whatever else they could forage. 3 times they had to hide while Japanese patrols passed within 20 feet of their positions. On the 19th of May, 1943, they reached the southern coast of Mindanao. Filipino guerrillas had arranged for a sailboat to take them to a small island where they could signal passing submarines. On the 2nd of July, 1943, the USS Trout, a fleet submarine on patrol, surfaced at their location and took them aboard. 25 days later, on the 30th of July, they arrived in Brisbane, Australia. General Douglas MacArthur personally greeted Dias and his fellow escapees. MacArthur, who had been forced to abandon the Philippines in March 1942 and had famously promised, "I shall return," understood immediately the significance of what these men represented. They were living proof of what was happening to the 76,000 American and Filipino prisoners still in Japanese captivity. Their testimony could fundamentally change American understanding of the Pacific War. MacArthur awarded Dias his 3rd Distinguished Service Cross on the 30th of July, 1943. The citation mentioned his escape from Davao, but said nothing about what he had witnessed during his time as a prisoner. MacArthur understood that decision about releasing that information would have to be made in Washington. On the 3rd of August, 1943, Major Ed Dias boarded a military transport aircraft for the flight to the United States. He carried with him a leather-bound journal containing approximately 40,000 words of testimony about the Bataan Death March, conditions in Japanese prison camps, and the treatment of American prisoners. He expected to be received as a hero to tell his story to the American people, and to generate public pressure for relief efforts for the prisoners still in Japanese hands. What happened instead would transform the final 5 months of his life into a nightmare of bureaucratic suppression and official indifference that would end only with his death under circumstances that many would later describe as convenient for those who wanted him silent. Dias arrived in Washington on the 8th of August, 1943, his 27th birthday. He spent the next 3 weeks in continuous debriefings with officials from the War Department, the State Department, and the Office of War Information. He repeated his testimony dozens of times, answered hundreds of questions, and provided documentation, including names, dates, and locations of atrocities. The officials took careful notes, but gave him no indication of when or if his testimony would be released. On the 1st of September, 1943, Dias was ordered to the Ashford General Military Hospital in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. The facility, which had been the Greenbrier Resort before the war, served as a debriefing center for returned prisoners and intelligence personnel. Dias spent 6 weeks there under what amounted to house arrest. He was forbidden from contacting the press. His mail was censored. His telephone calls were monitored. When he asked when he could tell his story publicly, he was told the decision would be made at the highest levels. The highest levels meant President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his War Department leadership. They faced a difficult decision. Releasing Dias's testimony would expose Japanese war crimes and likely generate enormous public outrage. That outrage might translate into pressure to shift more resources to the Pacific Theater, potentially compromising the Europe First strategy that Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had agreed upon. It might also endanger the prisoners still in Japanese hands if the Japanese perceived the revelations as propaganda designed to inflame American public opinion. But there was another consideration, one that would not become clear until later. Roosevelt and his advisors were concerned about the political implications of Dias's testimony. The story of the Bataan Death March raised uncomfortable questions about why the United States had been caught so unprepared in the Philippines, why reinforcements had not been sent, why 78,000 men had been allowed to surrender to a numerically superior enemy. Dias's testimony included not just accounts of Japanese atrocities, but also implicit criticism of American strategic decisions. "We believed help was coming," Dias had told his debriefers. "We were told that convoys were on the way, that reinforcements would arrive, that the Navy would break through the Japanese blockade. We fought for 4 months based on those promises. When we finally surrendered, we learned that no convoys had ever been dispatched, that no reinforcements were coming, that Washington had written us off as early as January. Some of the men felt betrayed. That last sentence, 'some of the men felt betrayed,' was political dynamite. Roosevelt was preparing to run for an unprecedented 4th term in 1944. He could not afford questions about whether he had abandoned American troops in the Philippines. The decision was made to suppress Dias's testimony indefinitely, at least until after the election. On the 15th of October, 1943, Dias was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to the 337th Fighter Squadron, 329th Fighter Group, 4th Air Force. The assignment seemed like a reward, a return to flying after 15 months as a prisoner. But there was a catch. Dias was forbidden from discussing his POW experiences with anyone. He was required to sign a statement acknowledging that unauthorized disclosure of classified information would result in court-martial. He was, in effect, silenced. The psychological toll of the suppression began to show. Fellow officers at his new assignment noticed that Dias seemed distracted and troubled. He had difficulty sleeping. He lost weight. He wrote long letters to family members, but couldn't explain what was bothering him because his experiences remained classified. He began drinking more heavily than usual, though he remained a skilled and professional pilot. On the 10th of December, 1943, Dias received orders to prepare to lead a squadron of P-38 Lightning fighters to the European theater. The deployment was scheduled for early January 1944. It seemed like an opportunity to get back into combat, to return to the war in a meaningful way, but those who knew him best sensed that something was wrong. He seemed resigned rather than excited, as if he understood that he was being sent away, not for military necessity, but to keep him far from Washington and the press. On the morning of the 22nd of December, 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Ed Dias took off from Grand Central Air Terminal in Glendale, California, for what should have been a routine proficiency flight. He was flying a P-38 Lightning, the same type of aircraft he would soon lead into combat over Europe. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited, winds calm. It was, in every sense, a perfect day for flying. At 10:23 hours, controllers received a distress call from Dias. His right engine had failed. He was attempting to make an emergency landing on a street in Burbank, California, approximately 3 miles from the airport. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the P-38 approaching the street at low altitude, landing gear down, apparently under control. Then something happened. A motorist, later identified as Helen Ross, age 43, of Burbank, drove her Chevrolet sedan into the intersection that Dias had chosen for his emergency landing. Witnesses reported that Dias could have continued his landing approach and almost certainly would have survived even if he had struck the car. Instead, he pulled up sharply, turned away from the street, and aimed for a vacant lot approximately 100 yards distant. The P-38 struck the ground nose first at approximately 120 miles per hour. The impact drove the engine back into the cockpit. Lieutenant Colonel William Edwin Dias died instantly. He was 27 years old. He had survived combat against overwhelming odds, the Bataan Death March, a year in Japanese prison camps, and a daring escape through enemy territory, only to die in a training accident in California, 3 months before his testimony about Japanese war crimes would finally be released to the American public. The official investigation concluded that Dias's death resulted from engine failure, combined with his decision to avoid striking a civilian vehicle. He was posthumously awarded the Soldier's Medal for heroism not involving actual conflict with an enemy. The citation noted that he had sacrificed his life to save that of Helen Ross, who was unaware of how close she had come to death until she read about the crash in the newspaper the next day. But there were those who immediately questioned the official narrative. Captain Samuel Gracchio, who had escaped from Davao with Dias, was at Grand Central Air Terminal when the crash occurred. He later testified that Dias had complained the previous day about problems with his assigned P-38, reporting that the right engine had been running rough and that maintenance crews had assured him it was fine. Lieutenant Leo Bolins, another Davao escapee, noted that Dias had been scheduled to give a classified briefing to War Department officials on the 27th of December, 5 days after his death, about conditions in Japanese prison camps. Major Michiel Dobervich, the doctor who had escaped with Dias, examined the crash site the next day. He later stated in an affidavit that the damage pattern seemed inconsistent with a simple engine failure. The right engine showed no signs of catastrophic mechanical failure. There was no evidence of fire before impact. The left engine appeared to have been at full power when the aircraft struck the ground. Dobervich noted that a P-38 could fly and land with one engine out, that this was a routine emergency procedure that every pilot practiced, and that someone with Dias's skill level should have been able to land safely, even with complete loss of one engine. These concerns were dismissed by the official investigation. The War Department concluded that Dias had made an error in judgment by attempting to land on a city street rather than continuing to the airport or finding a less congested area. The case was closed. Ed Dias was buried in Albany Cemetery in his hometown in Texas on the 29th of December, 1943, Approximately 3,000 people attended the funeral, the largest in the town's history. 31 days later, on the 28th of January, 1944, the War Department released Diaz's testimony to the press. The story appeared on the front page of newspapers across the United States under headlines like "Worst Horror Story of War Told," "Japanese Atrocities Revealed," and "The Greatest Story of the War in the Pacific." The Chicago Tribune serialized Diaz's complete account over 8 days, reaching an estimated 10 million readers. The New York Times called Diaz the one-man scourge of the Japanese, and devoted 2 full pages to his biography and testimony. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Congressional switchboards were flooded with calls demanding action against Japan and relief efforts for prisoners of war. The War Department received more than 40,000 letters in the first week after publication. Opinion polls showed that public support for the war in the Pacific increased by 15 percentage points virtually overnight. Churches held special prayer services for prisoners of war. Cities organized rallies demanding that the government do more to help captured Americans. But Ed Diaz never saw any of it. He had died 37 days before his story was released, silenced by the government he had served with such distinction. His warnings about the treatment of American prisoners suppressed for political convenience until the moment when those in power decided the timing was right. The questions about his death, about whether it was truly an accident, about whether someone might have had a motive to ensure he didn't live to see his testimony published and answer the questions it would raise. Those questions were never officially investigated. In the years following the war, 12 of the 14 men who escaped from Davao with Diaz gave interviews about their experiences. All 12 mentioned that they believed Diaz had been deliberately silenced by the government. None could provide proof, but they noted certain facts. That Diaz had been pushing hard for release of his testimony in the weeks before his death. That he had threatened to go public with his story regardless of official disapproval. That he had told several people he believed his life was in danger, and that his death occurred at a remarkably convenient time for those who wanted to control when and how his testimony became public. Samuel Gracio, who went on to serve with distinction in Europe and retired as a colonel, stated in a 1963 interview, "Ed was the most skilled pilot I ever knew. The idea that he couldn't handle a single-engine landing in a P-38 is absurd. He had done it multiple times in combat with aircraft that were shot full of holes. The plane he was flying that day had been in maintenance 3 times in the previous week. Someone didn't want him talking, and someone made sure he never would." The truth about Ed Diaz's death will never be definitively established. The crash investigation file was routinely destroyed after 7 years, standard procedure for closed cases. The maintenance records for the P-38 he was flying were lost in a fire at Grand Central Air Terminal in 1947. Helen Ross, the motorist whose car triggered the crash sequence, died in 1951 without ever giving a detailed interview about what she had seen. The physical evidence is gone. Only questions remain. But what is beyond question is the systematic suppression of Diaz's testimony by the United States government for 5 months after he risked everything to bring it home. What is beyond question is that he was forbidden from speaking about atrocities he had witnessed, while bureaucrats in Washington debated the political implications of his revelations. What is beyond question is that he died under circumstances that multiple expert witnesses found suspicious, at a time when his continued silence was still politically useful, and that his testimony was released only after his death ensured he could never answer questions about it or push for additional disclosures. The scale of what Diaz documented and what the government suppressed is staggering when examined comprehensively. He had provided testimony about approximately 200 specific atrocities he personally witnessed. He had documented the deaths of approximately 7,000 to 10,000 men during the Bataan Death March. He had cataloged the systematic starvation of 2,000 American prisoners at Davao. He had recorded death rates of 50 men per day at Camp O'Donnell. He had provided names, dates, locations, and circumstances for dozens of war crimes. But more than that, he had provided evidence of a larger truth that the Roosevelt administration found deeply uncomfortable. That the United States had been caught unprepared in the Philippines. That American and Filipino troops had been abandoned to their fate. That promises of reinforcement had been lies. And that 78,000 men had been sacrificed to buy time for the United States to mobilize its industrial power. The story of the Bataan Death March wasn't just about Japanese atrocities. It was about American failure. The government's decision to suppress that story for 5 months, to silence the man who tried to tell it, and then to release it only after his death, revealed a truth about power and politics that transcended the specific circumstances of the Pacific War. It demonstrated that even in a democracy fighting a war against totalitarianism, truth could be subordinated to political expediency, that whistleblowers could be silenced even when they were heroes, and that the timing of revelations could be manipulated to serve the interests of those in power rather than the needs of those suffering. Today, Dyess Air Force Base in Abilene, Texas, covers approximately 6,000 acres and is home to the 7th Bomb Wing, operating B-1 Lancer bombers. The base was renamed in Dyess's honor on the 1st of December, 1956, 13 years after his death. At the entrance to the base stands a memorial consisting of a P-40 Warhawk, painted to represent Kibosh, the aircraft Dyess flew in combat over the Philippines. Nearby is a bronze plaque listing his accomplishments: 3 Distinguished Service Crosses, 1 Soldier's Medal, leadership of the only successful large-scale prison escape in the Pacific Theater, and his role in revealing Japanese war crimes to the American people. What the plaque does not mention is that he was silenced by his own government for 5 months before his death. It does not mention that he died under circumstances that multiple witnesses found suspicious. It does not mention that his testimony was released only after he could no longer answer questions about it. It does not mention that the timing of his death was remarkably convenient for those who wanted to control his story. On a clear day in December, visitors to the memorial sometimes ask tour guides about the circumstances of Dyess's death. The standard answer, provided in a laminated fact sheet available at the base visitor center, states that he died in a training accident while attempting to avoid a civilian vehicle, and that he was posthumously awarded the Soldier's Medal for his heroism in sacrificing his life to save a civilian. It's a neat, heroic narrative that fits comfortably within the larger mythology of World War II. But occasionally, a visitor will ask a follow-up question. If he was such a skilled pilot, how did he lose control of a P-38 during a routine engine outlanding? Why were the maintenance records for his aircraft lost? Why was his testimony suppressed for so long? Why was it released only after he died? The tour guides, reading from their official script, have no answers to these questions. They explain that the crash investigation file is no longer available, that records from that era were routinely destroyed after 7 years, and that questions about the details of Lieutenant Colonel Dyess's death cannot be definitively answered. But we know what he accomplished, the tour guides always conclude. We know that he was a hero, that he risked everything to tell the truth about what happened to American prisoners of war, and that his testimony helped the American people understand the true nature of the enemy we faced. That's what matters. That's what we honor. It's a comfortable conclusion, one that avoids the harder questions about what happens when heroes become inconvenient, when truth threatens political interests, and when those in power decide that the timing of revelations matters more than the rights of those who who bear witness. The story of Ed Dyess isn't just about Japanese war crimes, or even about one man's extraordinary courage. It's about the price of speaking truth to power, about what governments do when heroes won't stay silent, and about the questions that remain when convenient accidents eliminate inconvenient witnesses. The Bataan Death March, which Ed Dyess documented with such precision and at such personal cost, resulted in the deaths of approximately 7,000 to 10,000 men in 6 days. That atrocity shocked the American people when it was finally revealed in January 1944, and helped generate the determination to fight Japan to unconditional surrender. But the revelation came only after the man who survived to tell the story had died in what the official investigation called a training accident. The mathematics of that timing, the convenience of that silence, the systematic nature of the suppression that preceded it, all suggest a different kind of atrocity, one perpetrated not by a foreign enemy, but by those who claim to be protecting national security. The file on Major General Searles's desk on the morning of January 28, 1944, contained the testimony that would shock the nation and change the course of the Pacific War. But it also contained, though Searles may not have fully realized it, evidence of a cover-up that would raise questions for generations. The greatest story of the war in the Pacific, as the War Department called it, was also a story about the greatest lie. That Ed Dyess died in a simple training accident, at a simple moment of mechanical failure, with simple heroic consequences. The truth, as those who knew him best understood, was far more complex. Ed Dyess died because he wouldn't stay silent. He died because his testimony threatened powerful interests. He died because the timing of his revelations mattered more to those in Washington than his right to speak or his life to continue. And he died, most tellingly, at precisely the moment when his death served the interests of those who had spent 5 months trying to control his story. Whether that death was an accident, a tragedy, or something more sinister may never be definitively established. The evidence is gone, the witnesses are dead, and the official files have been destroyed. But the questions remain, as uncomfortable today as they would have been in 1944. What happens when heroes become inconvenient? What price do whistleblowers pay for speaking truth? And what does it say about a democracy when the greatest story of the war can only be told after the man who lived it has been silenced forever? Ed Dyess wanted the American people to know what had happened to their sons and brothers in the Philippines. He risked everything to escape and tell that story. He endured 5 months of bureaucratic suppression and official indifference. And he died, in the end, without ever seeing his testimony published, without ever receiving public recognition for his extraordinary courage, without ever answering the questions his revelations would raise. He paid the ultimate price for his determination to tell the truth. Whether that price included murder or merely tragic coincidence, the result was the same. Silence, permanent and complete, exactly when those in power needed it most. The Bataan Death March claimed approximately 7,000 to 10,000 lives in 6 days. The cover-up that followed claimed at least one more, the man who survived to bear witness. That is the mathematics that no official history acknowledges, the calculation that no memorial commemorates, and the truth that no comfortable narrative can erase. Ed Dyess died so that the American people could know what happened in the Philippines. But he died, more specifically, because those in power had decided the timing of that knowledge mattered more than his life. That is the real story of Ed Dyess. Not just a hero's tale of combat and escape and testimony, but a darker story about the price of truth, the convenience of silence, and the questions that remain when heroes die at exactly the right moment for those who want them dead. The greatest story of the war in the Pacific was also, in the end, a story about the oldest abuse of power, the elimination of witnesses who won't stop talking. History remembers Ed Dyess as a hero. It should also remember him as a warning about what happens when governments decide that political expediency matters more than truth, when the timing of revelations is more important than the rights of witnesses, and when convenient accidents eliminate inconvenient heroes. That lesson, learned in the skies over Burbank on a clear December morning in 1943, remains as relevant today as it was 81 years ago. Power protects itself. Heroes who threaten that power die. And the truth, when it finally emerges, comes too late for those who sacrificed everything to reveal